In the second half of this chapter, they talk about something that some people really like to do, which is to study the dead. There's various reasons why we might want to study the dead. One of them is to, as they put it, reveal those forgotten by history. So people perhaps that ended up in mass graves or were in some ways subjected to conditions under which they were malnourished. In this case, they give us the example of a study of people who were in the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, and where they were put into workhouses and the kinds of things that you can reveal from digging up and exhuming some of these skeletons. It gives us a sense of the life conditions of people in the past. Another way in which we can study those who are dead, which is perhaps more recent, is the idea that you can be seeking justice for victims. And so oftentimes anthropologists are doing the skeletal analysis of people who have died a long time ago to try and figure out various demographic trends and things that happened in human history. But it also can be useful for right now or the present. What can we do with these when we get all this information about somebody who has died? Okay, so sometimes you're trying to get, by studying skeletal or other remains, you can get a biological profile of age and sex and ancestry and match it up to databases so you can try and figure out who that is. Sure. So one is, and you can also try to figure out what happened to this person, evidence of violence, what kind of weapon might be used, those kinds of things. You can get, that's such a cool word, taphonomy, which is the study of how dead bodies decay over time. So this has been important for people studying, say, evolution and trying to figure out what was going on with if bodies were buried or not, and what happens to bodies as they decay. But it can also be used to try and figure out the time of death in contemporary situations. This brings us to an area of anthropology which has had a lot of ethical concerns. As we saw, humans attach symbolic meanings to their remains. And so when we are studying the dead, it's complicated because some people are not necessarily going to want their remains or the remains of their relatives or the remains of people in their group to be studied, because it seems weird. Now, if someone is recently gone, they have what is called informed consent. So this could be something that somebody wants to say, donate their body to science, or they want to be an organ donor, or their relatives say, okay, well, you can study this person because I want to know what happened to them. So informed consent is a good thing to have for the recently gone. But as they put it, when it comes to people who are not around anymore and have been dead for a long time, it can be a little bit more challenging. Now, there are some groups that really like this. They're like, yeah, let's get some genetic testing and let's get our ancestors dug up and we want to know about this. And it can be very informative to study the dead of a certain group. And so there are some groups that do see it as an exciting way to get more information about who they are today. There are other groups that see it as violation, that it's fundamentally unethical and wrong to be studying all the bones that are dug up. What might influence whether you see this as exciting or as a violation? Who might be more likely to see this as good, studying remains, great, want more information about my ancestors, and who might be like, I don't know about this, don't like it?
Maybe a group that doesn't know a lot about their past would like to get the testing done.
All right, so that's one possibility. People who don't know that much about, there's just not a lot of information around. And so, for example, some people who who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, have been very interested in genetic testing and those kinds of things to try and figure out, well, what were who was I related to in Africa? Because as part of the slave trade, different groups were deliberately mixed together and basically tried to strip them of their cultural origin. So yeah, a group that doesn't know that much might be very interested in this. What else might influence this? Religion. How so? Okay. There's also the possibility of different cultural beliefs, right? About we shouldn't be messing with people's bones like that or doing those kinds of things. So there could be religious differences as well. There's another thing. What kind of people got their bones dug up all the time without them having any say in it? Happened in America, by the way. Native Americans, right? And so for various reasons, and that's why often this is not just about culture or about information. Both of those things can be important. It also is the case that certain groups were basically subjected to this research and study. They never gave a consent, and their graves and have been, most of this happened 100 years ago or so, but were basically ransacked in the name of science. And many of those remains are still housed in museums today. And so they give us the example of Kennewick Man. And this was a case where a skeleton was found in the Pacific Northwest. And the scientists got all excited about it. And they're like, there's a 10,000-year-old skeleton. We need to test this. We're going to find out where the Native Americans came from and evolution and all this stuff. And there were tribes in the area that were like, no, this is this is another example of people going in and taking things away without permission. And the scientists won for a while, and the museum kept the Kennewick Man skeleton. They did all the DNA testing and all that stuff. But as our book tells us, then they actually found out that in fact it did have a genetic connection to local tribes in the area. And I'm sure perhaps it gave us some information, but in terms of who it was related to, it was actually related to to the groups in the area. And so it was eventually returned and reburied. So there can be some very difficult and ethical issues, especially for groups where this has happened to them over time. They've had their graves dug up repeatedly in the name of science or preserving culture. There's perhaps a more hopeful example, although this was in Lower Manhattan. Before it was the Manhattan of today, there were places where African Americans could go and live, but they weren't permitted to be in other places. And so they had certain cemeteries and burial grounds for their relatives. And that some of these were lost over time. What is now Central Park was actually built on what was once an African and Native American community. And in more recent years, they were trying to build a building in Manhattan, and they found some of these remains. And it was painful for people, but it actually led to a pretty successful collaboration between the people who were researching, trying to find out evidence for who these people were, and the community. And so in today's world, as they mentioned, this is a place where they do rituals and celebrations and have, in some ways, given us more of a sense of how important the African American contribution was to the building of New York City and the building of Manhattan. It can be a good thing if done respectfully. Now, I said that I wanted to tell you a little bit more about rites of passage, which they talked about earlier, but we're only talking about them in terms of funerals. But I want to elaborate on this a little bit more because it's something that anthropology has given us some insight into, and I can help you in understanding things that happen to you in your life, the traditions that you might observe or go through. So back a long time ago, a Dutch anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep wrote a book called The Rites of Passage, in which he surveyed among all different societies what do people do in these rituals as they are marking transitions from one stage of life to another? And he determined, or that in almost all the cases, that there are these distinct phases. And in the first phase, whoever's going through this ritual is separated from normal life. What do I want to do here? Let's do a marriage. So in a marriage, right, in the marriage ceremony, oftentimes we separate those two people from normal life when we dress them up in funny clothes. And sometimes you're not allowed to look at the person who's in the funniest clothes before they come in down the aisle. There's all these ways in which they are held in their separate rooms. And then there's this period of transition. And this was later called in anthropology a time of liminality, a time in which you are neither here nor there. You're in a state of betwixt and between. And in this time of liminality, the usual norms might be suspended for a while. So, in terms of, say, a wedding, there's a big party and everybody's doing things, and there's this time in which there's a big sense of community coming together, and the usual norms are overturned, and people are sleeping with people they wouldn't normally sleep with, and kinds of crazy things are happening around weddings. So this is often a time when the usual ideas get turned upside down. And then you have a time in which people are then put into their new roles and put into the world. So I pronounce you married, and then they enter society in their new roles. They are reincorporated as a member of that society. Now, we actually do some of these. This can help you in your life when you're getting married, but even something like coming into college, you may have gone through this a little bit. It's a mini version of a rite of passage when we do that little, what do we call it? That opening ceremony. And so, we have to all put on our blue shirts. Oh, some of you are still wearing them. You all have to put on your blue shirts and you walk down the aisle, and the professors have to dress up in their goofy costumes. And so you have this time, and then there's this transition period, and you're betwixt and between things, and there's a big party, and you start doing college student things, and then you are marked as, aha, I'm a college student. Again, at the end of your college career, you'll do the commencement. Again, you'll be dressed in a goofy costume. Professors get dressed up in other goofy things. You'll have your graduation parties and all these things. And then you'll be reincorporated into society as a grown up, as a person who's ready to live and be an adult or be in a job. So you can look at these little rituals that we do as a rite of passage. You can even see college itself as a big rite of passage in which you are separated a little bit, at least. Some of you, you're separated from your usual community. You come to this place, you live here together, and then you go through this pretty long period of transition, a time of liminality when the usual rules may not apply, and people are like, oh, don't worry, they're college students. And you get to experiment with new things, try new people, try new ideas. Just have that liminal time, and then eventually at the end, you're going to be reincorporated. And we're going to say, you've learned these lessons, and now you don't get it so easy. Now you have to work for your money, and you have to go out there and do this stuff. Now, again, this isn't a perfect, it doesn't always work perfectly, but it's a way in which we can analyze different parts of our lives. It's been very useful for people to think about various transition periods in their life: births, christenings, bar mitzvahs, and, as we've been talking about, funerals, in which case there is a separation. You go through this ritual, but then there's an acceptance of those new roles as people pass along.